down. You remember me from last night. Thank you so much. Gosh, also, how great are these coffee mugs? Let's give it up for some quality New Deal swag. And I know, I heard a rumor that Helen's right now pricing out New Deal branded ring lights for all of you to do your individualized communications content. So I'll reintroduce myself for those of you who may not have been there last night. My name is Emily Kane. I am a very proud 2010 New Deal leader while I was a Maine state legislator. And now I am a senior advisor to the New Deal, working with Debbie and the amazing team at the New Deal on a strategic growth plan. The board, the advisory board of the New Deal is such a committed group, and several of them are here today. Board of advisory members, raise your hand. It's there, Helen, Greg, there's many in the room. Right here, Mitch is in front. So they have brought me on. I just want to give you 2 minutes on what I'm doing, because I'm going to be reaching out to some of you. New Deal has now been around for 13 years. It has had immense impact. You heard Debbie this morning talking about the power of leaders, the power of ideas. Our strategy is that more people need to know what we do, right? More people need to know the power of the New Deal network so that we can, yes, raise more money from them to do even more and reach even more people. We need to help you tell your stories even more. And that's part of what we're going to talk about this afternoon with Ian and with Liz and with Karen. And I'm working on doing interviews. I've interviewed 20 members between the two boards already. And I'm going to be reaching out to some of you who are current or, like me, former elected leaders to have real conversations about what is the New Deal's potential for growth? And I'm going to thank you in advance for responding yes to me when I reach out to you to schedule those meetings. But this afternoon is really focused on this concept of authentic and effective communication. I would say if one theme has been developed already here today, it's that. Right? Whether we were talking about any of the incredible ideas about the environment or housing or food, or this morning, we thinking about the opportunities in 2024, authentic and effective communication was really the sort of other panelist on that big panel this morning. The good news is this afternoon, we're going to do a deep dive. The way this is going to go is first we're going to hear from our friend Ian Kahn, who is, of course, a communications consultant and coach for the New Deal. Many of you have worked with Ian. And then we're going to transition into a conversation that I'm going to have the privilege of moderating with Karen Finney and Liz Smith, who I'll tell you more about in a little bit. But now, it's funny, he doesn't really need an introduction because you know him, but I'm going to do it anyway to make him wait just 1 second. So Ian Kahn, our friend, is a media and communication coach specializing in virtual communication. How many of you in here have worked with Ian? I have. Great. How many of you loved it? Oh yeah, all of you. I knew that. And Ian, who you might have heard, was a professional actor for 25 years, and he's been on sabbatical, a very active sabbatical since 2019, when he was brought on by Debbie for the New Deal to work with these leaders who I know, because he tells me, inspire him so much every single day. He also works with the New Dems in the House of Representatives. He works with Global Win, and he works with other political leaders and business leaders as private clients as well, while continuing his work with the New Deal. I've been lucky to now call Ian my friend because of this work. Let me turn the microphone over to him now to share some thoughts on effective and authentic communication. Ian.
Is this on? Great. Thank you, everybody. Looking out here, and I'm seeing so many friends, and it's quite wonderful. It's wonderful to see you all in person. First, I want to take an opportunity to thank you, Emily, but also to thank Debbie Cox-Bolton for inviting me to go on sabbatical from acting. And I would also like to thank Helen Milby for helping drive everything that I've been doing over the course of these many years. You know, when I was an actor for 25 years, and when I took this sabbatical from acting, now that we brought that up, I had a lot of actor friends who said, can I ask you a question? How do you spend time with actors for 25 years who are awesome people, and now you're working with political leaders who are essentially liars? And what I said is, actually, they're not at all. They're quite wonderful. They're just confused a little bit on how to share who they are. So here's what I'll share. Political leaders tend to struggle with an idea of projection. They put up an idea of what it is that they think, that we think, will make us more likable, more appealing, more electable. But the problem is that's exactly why people think that political leaders aren't honest. They don't know what it is, but they can read that there's something that isn't necessarily authentic in what they're sharing. So when you get into an interview or a debate, and you've got your projection up, and something happens that makes you nervous, that projection is going to slip. And then you spend the rest of that interview or debate just trying to get the projection back into place. And that's what people read. What I've been able to do with so many people, Lacey Beatty, Elizabeth Parker, Hunchofsky, John Mitchell, all of you, is get rid of that projection completely. So we can come from our authentic self. Now, what does that mean? Everyone's going to talk about this today. Authentic communication. Here's what I've learned so far about authentic communication. It's about sharing your vulnerability. I'm standing here in front of all of you lovely people, and I'm a little nervous. That's true. I'm going to let you see that. And in letting you see that, you actually see me. Which that makes you, in seeing me, connect to me more. We as human beings are vulnerable. If we look at what happened in war, people die. People's feelings get hurt. We're vulnerable. This projection idea is, I'm not vulnerable. I'm strong. I'm smart. We're not. We're nervous. Kind of scared. Pete Buttigieg was supposed to be here this morning. He's the best. Liz Smith. He's the best. And the reason he's the best, not just because he was a New Deal leader, which is pretty awesome that he was a New Deal leader, but also because he doesn't try to pretend to be something that he's not. And that's really what it's all about, whether it's Kristen McCarthy-Vahey, Andrea McClellan, Zabe Smathers, gave me the best line in the history of, I'm not going to tell that story. But how do we get to that vulnerability? And it's through certain exercises that we do in the room, something called conscious breathing that we work on. When you get to vulnerability, it's scary. Right, Elena? Yeah. But when we take that moment, it's a little bit like going in the ocean. You know when you go in the ocean, I grew up in Long Beach, Long Island, and you walk into the ocean and you kind of get your feet wet and it's cold. And you keep stepping forward. And you say, all right, now I'm going to let my knees get wet. God, it's cold. It's so cold. I'm going to hold this projection in place. And you know that as soon as you go into that water, it's going to be fine. But until you go into that water, you're going to be cold. The trick is to dive under that water. Let them see who you are. And the trick is, as Debbie Cox Bolton says to me all the time, she's like, you know, it's just easier to just be me instead of some idea of who we are. And what it gives you the opportunity to do, Dorsey appears. What it gives you the opportunity to do is to be yourself and let them see you. Because here's what I've learned about New Deal leaders. The more I see you, the more I like you. The more your constituents see you through life, the more they're going to like you. They won't like this. They're not going to like this. They're going to go, there's the liar. But if you allow them to see this, then you connect. And in this horrible, 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 horrible time, for our country. We're being challenged in every direction, internationally, inter-party. We need to find people who are willing to share themselves, to take that risk, to dive into that water. And then we can maybe do the healing that Debbie was talking about. We need it. The more I see you, the more I like you. Hunchowski, Natalia Macca, Laura Kask. Too many to name. If I didn't name you, it's just because I didn't see it. Moreau Weinberger. You guys are my people, and I'm honored to be able to do this work with you every day. I hope you could take a little something away, and the idea is this. Let this go. Let them see you, John, because then they're going to love you and you're going to grow. There are governors in this room. Not that what you're doing now isn't everything, because it is. It's everything. There's so much potential and so much actuality in this room. I love the New Deal. I love you people, and I'm so honored that I got a chance to share a little bit with you today. And if I haven't seen you in my room, I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. That was outstanding. A perfect way to set the tone for this conversation. As our wonderful panelists join me up here on stage. We really have had some great panels today, haven't we? And some great moderators. I'm hoping I can live up to the Simone Sanders Townsend. She was here this morning and she lit us up, and I immediately I feel like I'm a decent moderator, and then I was like, oh my God, I have to follow that. Okay, so this is really fun for me because I know, I've known Karen for a little while. I've admired Liz from afar. This is our first time meeting, though, today. And these are two people that when I think of really not just some of the best women in the communication space and politics, but the best people in the communication space, period. These two are at the top of the list. And this is a real treat, and I think a gift for all of us today to get to have this conversation. Karen Finney is someone who you may see on CNN as a political commentator. She's an advocate. She's a political strategist. She's a respected television commentator, leading political and communication strategist, and spirited thought leader. And I think that's really true. She's been working at the intersection of politics, media, and cultural change for more than 25 years. Her unique career roles have included top Democratic communication strategist and spokesperson, political commentator for CNN and MSNBC, television and radio show host, inspirational public speaker, business and communications advisor, leader and advocate for social justice and civil rights. Oh, and a White House staffer, that too. She brings this diverse combination of skills and experience to bear in her current work as a political commentator for CNN, host of TV One's Represent Our Voice, columnist and consultant working with nonprofit, for-profit, and political clients. She's on the board of several national organizations that reflect her commitment to empowering women, illuminating tough issues from different perspectives, and supporting the next generation of leaders. She serves on the board of Let America Vote / End Citizens United, Power Rising, and Ultraviolet. She's also co-convener of the Black Women's Leadership Collective. Please give a round of applause to my friend Karen. And to my left, we have Liz Smith, who is a Democratic strategist who has worked at every level of politics for state legislators, for mayors, for governors, for U.S. senators, and for presidents. She's most well known for her work on Pete Buttigieg's, I feel like I say his name and you're all gonna clap, so I'm gonna just give you the space. Go for it. Get the Pete clapping out. She worked for Mayor Pete / Secretary Pete on his presidential campaign, where her communications strategy was credited with launching his improbable rise. And I think that's really true. And last year, she wrote a great book, Any Given Tuesday, which was a behind-the-scenes look at politics, and it became a New York Times bestseller. Liz came down today from New York, and if you don't mind me saying, she's a brand new mom, too, and we're really excited she's here. with a sort of obvious question to the both of you, which when you just heard Ian talk about effective and authentic communication. I know for me, when I was a New Deal leader, I was the House Minority Leader in the main House. We took back the majority shortly after, which was great. But I would always say to my staff, let's just tell the truth. It's easier to keep track of, right? It was like, they would come to me with all the spin, and I would say, can we just say whatever's true, and then I can actually just remember that? And that's what I always think of. But what does authentic and effective communication mean to you? Karen, I'll go to you first, then we'll go to Liz.
Okay, actually when Ian was, thank you all, it's great to be here. When Ian was talking, I was actually, and you and I talked about this a little bit, Emily, I was thinking about Stacey Abrams, because I worked on her 2018 gubernatorial race. And I know, that's why I mentioned her. And we had a situation where, as we're going through her opposition research, figuring out all the ways and all the, especially as a black woman, all the, memes and various narratives we knew were going to come, one of which is women are not good with money, black people are shifty when it comes to money, that sort of thing. Maybe there have been some financial scandals in Atlanta, but anyway, that sort of play into that. Anyway, and, she's a tax attorney. And one of the things that came up was, and her chief of staff said it to me this way, well, she didn't pay her taxes for 4 years. And I was like, I'm sorry, what happened? She what? And so, they're like, here's the spin we've come up with. And I said, well, hold on. What happened? Just tell me what happened. Well, turns out her parents, who are ministers, lost their home in Katrina. After they lost their home in Katrina, her brother went to jail. When he went to jail, her mother and father had to raise his daughter. Then her father got diagnosed with cancer. And as Stacey says, and I told her, keep saying that, you can put off a tax payment, but you can't put off a cancer treatment. So what happened was, particularly, which is a narrative for a lot of black women in particular, she had to take care of the family because nobody else in her family had the resources to help support her family. So that's what happened. And I said, well, that's the story that's what we're gonna say. It's the truth, it's your vulnerability. And by the way, it's the truth for millions of Americans. It's what's happening for a lot of people, particularly in this sandwich generation, right, where you're trying to, and I said, look, what we're gonna do is we're gonna write an op-ed so that we get to tell this story first, right? So we're gonna be authentic, but we're gonna tell it on our terms, because it's still politics, by the way, right? So we did that, and it was just a game changer. I mean, people would come up to her in airports and just thank her because, again, so many people are dealing with the same thing and felt so much shame about it. And part of what she was able to do in writing about it was to transform shame into a conversation about just the reality of trying to balance life. And frankly, I think it made people see her as more of why she would be a good governor, right? As someone who actually understands because she lived it. And she was bringing her authentic lived experience to the role. So to my mind, when we talk about authentic communication, I think it's really important that we're always thinking about how do we bring our authentic self to the role in all of our roles, in all of the parts of our lives, because those lived experiences are the reason you are in elected office, that you've won the races that you've won, and hopefully why you will win going forward if you're able to stay in that authenticity.
Thank you, Karen. That is exactly right. And I agree. Liz, I wanted to get your take on this too, because you, again, working with some people at different levels, what does it mean to you, effective and authentic?
Yeah, so I mean, authenticity is a word that we throw around a lot in politics, go out there, be authentic. And I remember one time I was doing media prep with a governor at the time, and he was like, well, what the hell does that mean? And it is worth actually discussing what does that mean. And to me, what it means is knowing who you are, knowing what you believe, and being comfortable in your own skin. Because voters, with all their flaws, I do believe that one thing they can do is they can sniff out a phony. They can tell when someone isn't comfortable in their own skin. They can tell when someone is just parroting talking points that have been fed to them by a political consultant like me or like Karen. And a great example of someone who I think was able to be his authentic self, lean into his strengths, perceived weaknesses, and really integrate that with his message and do it really effectively was Mayor Pete Buttigieg. And, when he was running for president, when he started running for president, people were like, oh my God, who's going to go out and vote for a 37-year-old openly gay mayor of a town of 100,000 who's never spent time in D.C., a veteran of post 9/11 war, just had a very, very different bio from what you're used to. But he actually leaned into all of those things that other people might have said made him different or made him unelectable, and use them as proof points, because he was running as someone who would offer something completely different from what was going on in Washington at the time. Someone who could sort of turn the page on the sort of the old generational warfare, the endless partisanship, and bring a new, fresh perspective. And you can't really get anything any more different from what was going on in Washington than someone with Pete's bio. But in terms of effectiveness, I really do think, and we'll get more to this, I don't want to drag this out too much, is like what I consider effective communications in political communications is when you're able to cut through the noise, when you're able to break out beyond sort of the amen choir on Twitter, in our political circles, and really have quote unquote normal people listening to, repeating the things that you're saying, the people who don't live and breathe politics every day. And we saw, again, I'm going to use Pete as an example here again, which is that and Mike Schmuel, shout out, he was Pete's campaign manager. When we were doing meetings with Pete in 2018, early 2019, sort of bringing him around, introducing him to reporters, media types, political types, a lot of the feedback we got on him was, I like him, smart guy, but is he really going to be able to break through in today's media environment? And of course, as Ian was saying before, like he's now viewed as one of the best communicators, so it's sort of funny thinking about it. But and people were saying, well, he doesn't really have the sizzle, he's not a brawler. You don't really, he doesn't have what it takes in this moment. And there was this view at the time that to sort of succeed and thrive, you had to go on cable news, yell, scream, hyperventilate, and that to beat Trump, you had to beat Trump. And the first time that Pete was given a national platform, a nationally televised platform, was a CNN town hall. And he took off like a rocket ship after it. And why he was able to take off like a rocket ship was because, his gamble turned out, the gamble that he took turned out to be correct, which is that people didn't think you had to beat Trump to beat him. They wanted the antidote to Trump. They wanted the ultimate counter-programming. And what helped him break through was not by yelling and screaming and calling everyone who disagreed with him a racist, homophobe, xenophobe, white supremacist, and like losing his mind. It was by actually speaking in nuanced, thoughtful, respectful ways to people, being willing to go against sort of, what the normal partisan things are that you're supposed to say, and cut through a lot of the noise that we had in Washington. So I do think it's really, really important when you're going out there and communicating to be willing to go against the grain a little bit, and understand that just because everyone else is doing something, you don't need to follow that course. And I think that Pete was a great example in how by going against the grain, you can really succeed and break through.
So that is great. And both of those examples are people I know and have observed and watched. And I think you're talking to a room full of state and local amazing leaders, right, who are trying to cut through. And earlier conversations today about politics, we were talking about how many ways people get their information, right? TikTok and I'm not on TikTok, so I don't really speak it, but I know it's out there. TikTok and internet of Instagram and Facebook and all the things. There's so many channels. And so I think the question I have is, how do you achieve being effective and authentic when there are so many channels and also this pressure, real or imagined, for content creation, right? There's this sort of drive to create content all the time. And I think you're looking at a room, we talked earlier, sort of joked about getting everybody a ring light so they could make more, content on the fly, which is probably a fun idea, but it's all consuming, right? So where's the balance? What's the best tips or tricks you have when it comes to breaking through and dealing with that weight of pressure of content creation? You look like you're ready to go.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm sure we both are.
Yeah.
Karen knows her stuff too. So what I would say is the advice, whenever I first sit down with someone, the advice I give them when they're sort of setting out on their communication strategy is, who are you? I hate this term, sort of cringy, but like, what is your brand? Because it's really important to know, sort of the image that you're going out to portray to people, because you're going to present yourself differently if you're a change maker or a reformer versus if you're a disruptor or an elder statesman, for instance. So it's really important to know sort of how you want to position yourself. Second, it's really important to have clear goals in mind, right? So what is your goal for the next year? What is your goal for the next 3 years? And try to fit everything that you're communicating into something that will get you to that goal. So, maybe your goal is to get elected to higher office. Okay, so set out a plan for that. Maybe your goal is to get legislation passed. Have a plan for that. The third thing that's really important is to know your issues and stick to your issues. In politics, it is very, very easy to get pulled in a million different directions, especially when you're communicating and doing media. And we all know that. You turn on cable news and you see a congressman or a congresswoman on there who's like a deer in headlights commenting on an issue that they have no idea what they're talking about. So find a few issues that are in your strike zone, become a leader on that, become very effective on that, and don't let yourself get pulled into a million different directions. The people who have the most longevity in this business, the people who are able to go the furthest, are the people who have these set issues, speak to them, become experts in them, and become leaders in those fields. And then the last thing I would say is that's really, really, really important in terms of communications is practice, 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 practice. Practice with your staff. Go through every iteration of every question that you could ever get in a media interview. Practice when you're in the shower. Do things like go on smaller media outlets, talk to cable, talk to college publications, talk to podcasts that maybe only 50 people listen to, because you can just get your reps in. And the more you do that, the more you'll be comfortable going to bigger and bigger outlets. And so, again, I just keep having those very clear, defined goals, defined issues in. Those are the things that can really help you go out there, be comfortable in your own skin, and really sort of own the communications piece of your portfolio.
Karen, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I agree with everything, not surprisingly. I am also someone, I hate talking points. So like when people give me talking points, I'm like, okay, but really what are we trying to say? And then I figure out how am I going to say that in words that I use and the way I talk. And that also goes to brand, which is, it's okay if an advisor, I'll probably get myself in trouble, but I'll just say it, says, hey, we should go out and say X, and you say, you know what, that's a great point, but I can't say that. That's not for me. That's not my message. That's okay. And then maybe you figure out, but here's what I can say. Here's what would be comfortable for me, or here's what makes sense for what my background is, or I've got this story that relates. So I think that's a really important point. And the other one about not being drawn into commenting on something, I'm sure you guys talk about this in your media training, but I'll just say it. It's okay to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you on that. We think again, there's a little bit of vulnerability that peeks through, but it's actually okay to say you don't know. And frankly, that's better than making up new policy on the spot. As my former boss, Howard Dean, used to do when he was governor. I worked with him at the DNC, not on his campaign, but that's a whole other story. But
you might get into those stories at some point. Who knows?
Yeah. But actually working with him was a great way to learn that, right, was because he never does talking points. So we always were having the conversation about, well, what are you trying to say? And then I would say to him, like, here's what I think you think you said, but here's what people heard. And having somebody give you that feedback loop is really important. Also to make sure that you're clear in what you're trying to say and what you're trying to communicate. And when you're practicing, that is a part of how, having somebody give you that feedback that says, you know what, I'm not sure that what you think you're trying to get across is actually coming across. I think that's another really important way, sort of feedback loop. The other thing I would say, though, is unfortunately the reality is in this fractured media environment, you have to do all of it, right? Your campaigns have to do all of it. Your team has to figure out how to do all of it. And what that means is also understanding the differences between each of these channels, right? I mean, one of the reasons, I'm not saying that I agree with him, he's a liar. Donald Trump is a great communicator, and he uses social media brilliantly, in part because he sort of treats content and his comments more as a production, right? He's constantly thinking about how am I disrupting the narrative. And he's very authentic in what he says in every channel. But so it's important, what you do on, I don't even know if Snapchat's still a thing. I think it is. Snapchat, maybe. I don't know.
I'm seeing some.
Yeah, it is. Okay.
Okay.
But TikTok, what you would say and do on TikTok is different than Instagram, different than X, formerly known as Twitter, because I refuse to just say X, is different than Facebook, is different than if you do a radio interview, is different than when you do a television interview. So the other thing I would just add is part of the way you break through is both being clear who you are, what you're trying to say, but understand the medium that you're communicating in and what's going to break through. So a particular message, you might create a short video that goes out on TikTok. I know some people don't do it, or even like Instagram Reels. That content and those images might be different than how you said it if you were in a radio interview. So understanding what's going to break through in each medium, because they're all very different in terms of what catches people's attention.
Quick question. Is there such a thing as bad content now when it's all about being out there?
Yeah.
I would hope so. I was hoping
yeah.
I was hoping the answer was yes. I just wanted to ask it.
And the other thing to be mindful of is that because of, with our phones, every single person you encounter is a content creator. So that means, and this is one of the reasons why I think being your authentic self everywhere you are is, like you said, the truth is easier to remember, right? It's also easier because there really is no off the record anymore. There really is no, think about how many times something has leaked out from a fundraiser. A basket of deplorables comes to mind, right? Where the person thought it was closed. That doesn't exist really anymore. And so, yes, there is such a thing as bad, or the other way to say it is unhelpful, right? And to my mind, it's the worst is when it is something. I've got two ways, right? One is it's something that challenges what people think about you in a negative way. Right? Like, I thought she was really straightforward and honest, but that comment doesn't jibe with that. Or if it's something that reinforces a negative. Like, I'll give you an example. With Ron DeSantis, this whole thing about his boots, cowboy boots. Why does that resonate? Well, in part because it's so petty. And we think of him as being so petty, and it just plays into something we already believe about him that is a negative.
Okay, so before we name drop too many other people, I do want to ask you both, but I'm going to say you're not allowed to use Stacey Abrams or Pete Buttigieg, and you're not allowed to use Donald Trump. I want you to tell me who the best and worst communicators are out there. Okay, let's call it best and in need of improvement. Who could do better? We don't want to, because everyone can grow, right? Not everyone has worked with Karen or Liz or Ian yet, so we're going to give them the opportunity to grow. So who's doing it best, and who would you really like to give some training to, or see them get some training to do it better?
So one person that I find to be really interesting and who has really, I think, broken through in the way that I sort of talked about before is Jeff Jett. Jackson. I think he's a New Dealer.
New Deal leader?
Yeah,
Yes.
New Deal leader. And he is someone who has really mastered TikTok, mastered Substack, and really broken through. I think he's got like 2.5 million followers on TikTok. Now, if you go to his TikTok, he's not on there co-opting youth memes, doing the latest dances, trying to pander to what you typically think of as a TikTok audience. What he's doing is going on there, being very straightforward, not being super yelly, screamy, as I said before, not being super partisan, but being very nuanced, very low-key, very honest, just doing direct-to-camera explainers of what's going on in Congress. And you know what? It seems so radically different because he's not trying to posture and trying to seem cool for the kids. He's not out there trying to be overly partisan and get people's heart rates up and say something that he will drive tons of low-dollar donations. He's just going out there and trying to demystify this very confusing, Congress for people. Like, how does a speaker get elected? What happened at the UFO hearings? Things like that. And he does say, for instance, going back to what Karen was saying when he was talking about the UFO hearings, he freely admitted, I don't know what the truth is, but I do think that this is an interesting thing for us to look into. And I do think that a lot of people, when they were thinking, who is a politician that's going to break through on TikTok, they weren't thinking it was going to be Jeff Jackson. And it just goes to show you that sometimes if you do treat voters like adults, if you do treat them like people who are capable of absorbing nuance and information in straightforward ways, you can really thrive. So I think he's a really interesting person. I really encourage all of you to go check out his TikTok and to check out his Substack. Another thing he's really good at is he doesn't use legislative speak and politician speak, and it really helps his message break through. In terms of someone who is not doing things well, I would say Vivek Ramaswamy. So, it drove...
Really? I'm shocked to hear you. Just kidding. I'm not shocked.
It drove me nuts. The number of reporters who called me this cycle saying, oh my God, Vivek is a new Mayor Pete. This young Harvard-educated guy coming out of nowhere, going everywhere, going on every media outlet, willing to talk to everyone. And I knew that he wasn't the next Mayor Pete, but I think the one thing that we've learned from Vivek is that not everyone can go out and do what Pete did, of going everywhere, talking to everyone, because the tactics themselves aren't what matters. It's the messenger who matters. And if you were just going on these shows to get on these shows, spew political talking points, say the most outrageous things that will get clicks with no sort of coherence behind them, you're not going to go very far. And what ultimately caught up to Vivek after sort of the initial sugar high was that then people were like, wait, on this show you said we need to zero out aid to Israel, but then in this debate you said Israel will have no stauncher ally than you. In this podcast you said 9/11 was an inside job, and this one, you completely you completely distance yourself from that. And if you don't have coherence, if you don't know who you are, if you don't have a clear issue platform, if you're just viewing each of these things as an ability to get a rise out of people, you're not going to succeed. And why Pete was able to succeed was because he knew who he was. He had a message. It was a message that tapped into the zeitgeist of where a lot of people in the Democratic Party were that day, and it was able to resonate. But it just goes to show that, tactics can only get you so far. The authenticity of the messenger really does matter.
Karen, how about you? Who's on your best and need improvement list?
Well, I'm going to use Liz's word interesting.
Okay.
I think that's
a
safer
It's a good euphemism.
way to frame it. Actually, I think John Fetterman is really interesting and really good.
He is.
He has really figured out how to, hoodie and all, how to remain his authentic self. I had a long story, brain tumor. My left vocal cord is paralyzed. So I also identify with him around his vulnerability and honesty, just around what happened to him. And the fact that he's been willing to talk about the ways in which he has to accommodate that and accommodate the fact that he's, and I will never forget was on CNN the night of the debate, and when he was really struggling. And of course, the two other brilliant white guys who were on with me said, oh, he's finished, he's done, no way. And I said, no, people, first of all, they already knew him, right? He was an established brand, so they liked him, and they knew, that's a really important thing too, by the way, when you're establishing yourself early and often and stay consistent, because then if something happens, people say, well, we know this guy, we know this person, we still believe in him. And that's what we saw happen. And he has continued to do that and be honest about his journey. He was so honest about depression and honest about, that is such an anathema to politics. And I just really respect it. And I've had the honor of talking to him about it a little bit. And I just, it is so hard to do that and to stay in that vulnerability, especially on Capitol Hill, where he's admitted, people make fun of him, that he needs, an extra minute sometimes to have the comprehension and then speak. So I just think he's a great example of someone who has just figured out, okay, how do I make this work for who I am now and for me in this moment?
And he's figured it out in the public eye,
Yes.
which is not something most people who have that kind of challenge have to do. They get an opportunity to go and be private. He didn't have that.
No.
It's been up front the whole time. That's a really interesting example. I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned him before, Karen, about Ron DeSantis, because if you're going to talk about somebody who maybe could use some improvement, I think we've all seen the Ron DeSantis sort of memes about his awkward smile and stuff like that. Is that also sort of an example of just not authentic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he looks like he is in so much pain when he's trying to smile. Even when he's like talking about his kids or his wife, which you would think these are things that you should be happy, right? This should be easy. But I just don't think that, I don't know the guy, so I can't say. But no, it does not feel authentic to him. What feels authentic is when he is name calling and brash and just being a jerk. That feels authentic. And it's a good, but look, it's real.
I see some Florida people nodding their heads. I think they are like, yes.
I mean, that's who that was his brand. And it was a great example of where I don't think he realized that brand was not going to sell outside of Florida, right? And tell me if I'm mistaken, but my understanding is that's actually not how he ran for governor, as this guy. He kind of became this guy a little bit. But really didn't understand why people would think that banning books was not a good idea, right? Or that, slavery, there were things that Black people learned. I mean, and you can see on his face, he just does not get it. Yeah. And that's the other thing I would just add to this conversation is know who you're talking to. Who are you trying to talk to, right? Because an interview that you're doing is never about the person who's right there in front of you. It's about who's going to watch this, who's going to read this, who's going to hear this. And so being conscious, that doesn't mean you change who you are, but be conscientious about who you're trying to actually reach and talk to. Just quickly, I would say, I think Nikki Haley, I don't agree with her, is another example of someone who's actually done a good job. Yeah, and one of the things I find most fascinating and will be curious to watch is, so many, having gone up against Trump in 2016, so many people have said, oh, you got to take him on and be tough and all this. Personally, I don't think that really works in general, because you can't out-Trump Trump, quite frankly. But it's been interesting to watch Nikki Haley take a different approach, and it's more in line with women leaders, right? She's talked about listening to the people and where the people are at, and we've got to, we got to hear where the people are. We got to, be honest where the votes are. So it'll be interesting to see if that strategy actually ends up, not the Vivek, which obviously he's tanking, ends up being the real way around it. I would love to see a woman actually be the one to,
be an amazing moment. That was not an endorsement of any kind for any Republican candidates in this room. So I'm looking around to see if any of you have questions. Oh, I see some hands going up. Okay. First hand I saw, right there. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks.
Say who you are, where you're from.
Hi, Rebecca Perkins-Quokka. I'm a state senator from New Hampshire. So just on the line of sort of like authenticity and content, one of the things I struggle with is like, in my true authentic self, I'm a real nerd, right? So I like to talk about like the nuance of a housing program, but the content that gets sort of the reactions are a picture of me with my daughter when I did her hair in a braid, and that's also me. So what I'm trying to figure out is how to blend what we said this morning about touting Democratic wins and talking about the successes of this administration when, like, my voters kind of just want to, like, see me being a person. And I guess I was just wondering if you guys could comment on, like, what is our authentic self, and are we being elected, to be us or to do housing policy? Like, sort of like, where do the voters meet us on that?
How many of you can relate to the I'm a nerd, but people like to see me with my dog or my kid? Yeah, I figured this is a room full of these people.
Yeah,
Advice, yeah.
But honestly, like, let your nerd flag fly. Most people have nerdy sides to them, have earnest sides to them. This is something I talk about in my book when I hate that I just keep coming back to Pete, but he is a really great example of all of this stuff, which was that, yes, he would go out there and could talk about policy, could tell really deep stories about his personal life, his time, serving overseas. But, like, a thing that people liked about him was that he was a little nerdy, and it stood out because I think, and again, this is something where Mike and I heard from a lot of, gray hairs in the party, a lot of political consultants, like, does he really have to go out there and speak 7 languages? Or does he have to go out there and talk about how he's passionate about sewer water? And it's like, yeah, he does, because that's authentic to him and that sets him apart. And I think having those moments where he could sort of nerd out and, speak in Norwegian in an interview, or do a deep dive on, sewer systems in South Bend, it showed people that, one, that he was really intellectually curious, that he was someone who'd had, spent a lot of time thinking about the rest of the world, something that was a really, really big contrast with our commander-in-chief at the time. And 2, that he was someone who really cared about all of these issues, both big and small. He wasn't just going out there and, again, talking about policy because he was told, okay, these are the top issues for people. It showed when he could nerd out on more obscure issues, issues that are obscure maybe to us or to most voters, that he was someone who had thought about things, both big and small. And I don't think that voters are looking for politicians to always be the coolest person in the room, to always, be the strong man. I think being able to show off your nerdy side, your personal side, your vulnerable side is really, really important with voters.
Yeah.
Let's get another question in there, if that's okay. Yeah, over here. Oh, wait, who you got? You got somebody over there? Go ahead. Yep. Sorry, we're going to do as many as we can.
Hi, Erica Strasburger, Pittsburgh City Council. Thank you all so much. It's been helpful. Karen, you had mentioned Nikki Haley. I wonder if you could zoom out and expand on female elected officials. And we know that some, oftentimes female elected officials are held to a different standard in their public communication. So any others you think do particularly well, or just general observations on what can distinguish a strong female elected official public speaker?
Sure. Well, there's lots of excellent research on this. Emily's list, where Emily's from, also has a lot of great stuff. The Barbara Lee Family Foundation has done 20 years of longitudinal data looking at women's leadership specifically, everything from what you wear and how you should talk and how to make direct eye contact, to the fact that, for a woman, when her negatives go up, it's much harder to get them back down. Men go up and they come right back down. But, so there's a lot of good research. I would just say, Nikki obviously had experience in it because she ran for governor. She ran for governor of South Carolina as a brown woman, right? So she figured out how to talk to conservative voters about some pretty tough issues, right? And how to do her politics around that. I think for women, though, in general, again, it's be authentic, right? People are gonna, women get questions, even if people don't say it, they're thinking, well, who's taking care of your children while you're here? Right? And you want to have I have a great family, I have a supportive family, whatever. Like, we're going to get more of those kinds of questions, more attacks on your hair, your clothes. I used to, people sometimes, if I don't have earrings on TV, I'll see something on Twitter about that, which is like, who cares, right? So yes, we are held to a completely different standard. We also have all of the standards of not being hysterical and wanting to make sure you sound like you know what you're talking about, and how to be authentic, but also how to be knowledgeable. One person I work with used to always want to cite the bill number as a way to say, and I was like, why do you want to do that? She said, well, I want people to know I know what I'm talking about. I was like, but nobody knows what you're talking about. You have to, nobody knows what SB 2122 is. You have to say, what's the thing? Say what it did, right? Say what it did for people. So, I mean, the one positive I will say, I know I'm jumping around because there's just a lot about women, but there are one of the things that I think is really positive, and Jeff Jackson actually did this, because I worked for Sherry Beasley. There are certain characteristics of women leaders that actually are a plus, right? One, being in a legislative body, because people see women as more collaborative and better at getting people around a table and trying to, figure out an answer. They also think women leaders are better at listening and actually then reflecting back what they heard, because women are good listeners. I'm not saying men aren't, but women are better, that's all. And Jeff Jackson, actually, when he was running for the Senate race, he started out with a listening tour, and his whole thing was that I'm out there listening to people. So part of it is also understanding what are the positive traits that you can lean into, like if you're a woman, particularly a woman of color. Voters don't see you as someone who is probably in the back room with the guys, smoking the cigars and drinking bourbon, right? We're already seen as a little bit of an outsider. Lean into that, right? So lean into the things that are positives about the perceptions that people bring to the table about you as a female leader. But also, and again, figure out how to use again, your lived experience as a plus, as a way to connect to people, I'm a big believer in storytelling, right? As a way to connect. So if you're talking housing policy, maybe don't start with the policy, start with a story about someone that tells the story of the policy. I think women tend to be good at that as well.
Awesome. Oh, I know we have lots of people who want to ask questions. Like over here was next. And how many minutes do I have? I have 5. Great. So we'll try to do a couple questions.
Okay,
Go
I'll
ahead.
do it fast. Thanks, everyone. I'm Laura Capps. I'm a county supervisor in California, and maybe some of you have this experience. Most people don't know what I do, and so they just talk to me about government in general. And so I've gotten really used to, I think the worst answer is, oh, I don't do that. That's city, or, oh, that's state, or I just answer the question, right? If it's something about Newsom or Biden, whatever. But that's worked up until now, because now I'm getting a lot of questions about Middle East, and I'm not asking to sort of dive into that, trust me, but I'm just wondering how to sort of like dip out or talk around it, because I'm really struggling. I've been protested. I'm really struggling with this one, because I mean, last time I checked, our county doesn't have a State Department. I have literally nothing to do with it, but I'm getting asked about it everywhere I go.
So a couple of thoughts on that, because a lot of organizations are also, who don't do international policy, are also seeing this, both with the people who work in their organization and because it's an issue in the community. So to my mind, I think there's 2 parts, right? Obviously, you're not going to speak on foreign policy. It's good to see you. We worked together in the Clinton administration. So obviously, you can't speak to foreign policy, but I think what you can do is speak to what's real and what's going on with people in that you serve, right? And speaking to that instead of, I mean, obviously you can refer them to where to find the policy or see what's going on. I think it's probably what you're getting, because we're seeing this in a lot of places, is just more people's angst about what is and the pain about what is happening. And so that's one where I feel like you've got to decide where you want to be on that and how you want to speak to that, and because I think that's probably more authentic.
Do you want to add on that, or you?
No, we can go.
Okay. Let's,
I agree with what
over
Karen
here.
said.
Yep. Great. And then we'll go over there.
Hi, I'm Kristen McCarthy-Vahey. I'm a state rep from Fairfield, Connecticut, and I'm so thrilled to see this power trio up there. Nerds are cool, and I really appreciate the last question, because this is real in our communities at every level of government. My question is about misinformation. We talked about it earlier today, and especially on social media platforms versus in person or on the radio or when it's a human-to-human interaction. At what point do you give folks advice to disengage versus engaging? Because more and more, especially with AI, we are going to need to make sure, and I know we keep using Pete, and he is a great example of being able to effectively push back, but there's a line as to when you, kind of like the toddler temper tantrums, just extinguish the behavior versus engaging and asking for help with getting that counter message out.
Yeah, look, I think it's really important with misinformation to really, I err on the side of pushing back and being more aggressive rather than less, because you never know what is going to take root. And so if you do see a false narrative getting out there about you on social media or in the media, or, you know, if your canvassers are at the doors, I think it's really important to try to correct the record while you can, because the longer things live out there, whether it's on social media or in the press, the more people can sort of pull them and refer back to them and use them as citations. And it's really, really unfortunate, but I think it's the nature of modern communications that if you don't, you know, cut something off, like, you know, before it takes root, it's really hard years later to go back and correct the record. And it does mean sometimes that you are, you know, punching down a little bit, you're wasting your time on things that you otherwise would not like to do. But we have seen, you know, examples of, you know, misinformation like that coming back and really just coming back to haunt people.
The only thing I would add to that is it doesn't necessarily have to be in your voice. You can have it in somebody else's voice, so that when you have to punch down, it's not you punching down, it's somebody else punching down. But also, research in the last couple of years has really shown it's okay and actually important, particularly for women, to call out what it is, right? And the source of it, right? We know what this is. This is, you know, right-wing or funded, you know, whatever the answer is, it's okay to do that too. So to have the not true, but then to kind of say, come on, we've seen this before, guys. We know what this is. Also is effective, particularly for the people who want to support you and want to know, well, what do we do? What do we say?
I'm going to ask you both to think about what advice you have for this group, but I think we have time for one other question maybe before we do that. If not, oh, over here. Here we go. Last question before I go to the final advice.
Okay, thank you. This on. I'm Stephanie Pitcher. I'm a senator in Utah. And one thing that I noticed as I think about social media is, like, I feel like I sort of have two tracks with social media. One is engaging with my constituents and getting reelected, but then the other is also, I know that my legislative colleagues see my social media, and I feel like maybe in my state, if you're too active in social media, it's sort of perceived as like showy in a way that isn't helpful when you're engaging with your colleagues. And I do think there's probably a gender divide. Like, I think women are seen as more showy than men that behave the same way on social media. But nonetheless, the gender dynamics aside, I'm just wondering if you've worked with candidates who have to balance these two dynamics. And I'll add that I am a Democrat in a very Republican state, and so if I'm too, like, left on social media, that's going to play well with my constituents because I live in Salt Lake City and it's about 70% Democrat. But it doesn't help me at all when I work with my Republican colleagues. And so I'm just curious if you've worked with other candidates that have these challenges and how you deal with that.
Yeah, I absolutely have. Last election cycle, I did a lot of work with Mallory McMorrow, a New Dealer in Michigan. And she was someone who went viral. She gave this amazingly forceful speech, you know, fighting back against a colleague who called her, you know, a groomer, accused her of sexualizing children, all just because she'd stood up to the, you know, anti-trans attacks in her state. And, you know, immediately she got all of this national attention, got this big social media following. And I do think there were some eye rolls among some of her colleagues, like, oh, she's always on cable news. Oh, she's always on social media. Is she an attention hog? And what was helpful, sure, that stuff is always going to be out there, you know, no matter what. But for her, I think how she was able to sort of combat those sorts of feelings about her was to show that when she was going on social media, when she was going on cable news, when she was doing these things, it was for the bigger goal of helping Democrats flip the state Senate. This wasn't just about getting money into her PAC. This was about, okay, we all believe that in Michigan we want to codify Roe. We want to fight back against election deniers. We want to fight back against the people who are demonizing, trans kids. Me going on cable news, me having stuff that goes viral on social media, me being able to raise money into a PAC that helps every candidate running for state Senate is not about me. This is not about my celebrity. This is something that helps the greater cause. And I think that the more that you can bring it back to the bigger goals that you have for yourself, the bigger goals that Democrats in your area, your state have, the more likely, the less likely people are to roll their eyes. It's always going to be a dynamic. Let's be real. Politics is full of a lot of catty, envious, jealous people, right? And we are competitive by nature, and that comes with the territory. But I do think that if you can find a way to channel sort of your strengths and your ability to break through on those platforms for a greater good, that can help sort of reduce some of the chattering against you.
I completely agree with everything.
Awesome. So we're going to wrap up now. And so this is a group of maybe slightly nerdy, very smart and hardworking, consensus building, pragmatic, just plain awesome humans that are helping to run state and local government across our country. We need them all to not only win elections, of course, but we really need them to be able to get good things done and take these ideas they have and move them to action. So I want to ask each of you, if you want them all to take things away from today's conversation, what is your best advice? What is your best approach or tip you can offer to this group of all-stars?
So I think we've shared a lot of our best thoughts and advice, and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, which is self-care. Because and I hope you've talked about it, if not, I'm just going to do it. It is so hard to be doing what you're doing. You know that. And it's going to just keep getting harder because of social media, because we're a very divided country, because people kind of suck sometimes. Like, they're mean. People can be really mean, and it's hard. And it's hard to constantly have to absorb that. And I don't think we think about it in that way, that when this is coming at you, even when you're doing something that you want to be doing, fighting for something you care about, it's still a fight. It's still energy that you're putting out. So my advice would be to be very real with yourself about what you need, whether that is to prepare for a meeting, for an interview, what's your process? We all have one. And what do you need to recharge, and to really work with your staffs to make sure that that is in your schedule and that you are protecting that time. Because if you don't do that, then you can't go out and do the fights and pass the great legislation and continue to win office. That would be my advice, is prioritize self-care in addition to everything else.
I love it. And what about you, Liz?
There's self-care. There's not a lot of that in politics, right? Especially on campaigns. I would say be willing to go out there and take some risks. Be willing to go out there and fail, right? And it's only through doing those sorts of things that you can really figure out who you are, what works for you, what works for the people you represent, what really resonates. And it's only by doing those things that you really have the opportunity to break through. And I mentioned Pete before. I just mentioned Mallory McMorrow, but she went out and she gave this, really heartfelt, really gutsy speech on the floor of the Michigan State Senate. And, overnight, it helped make her just sort of this voice against hate, but also this national voice for the importance of state legislatures. And if she hadn't been willing to take that risk, if she hadn't been able to put herself out there like that, we wouldn't have had this, amazing advocate for state legislatures on the national level. And she wouldn't have been able to go out there and raise, $2.5 million to flip the Michigan State Senate and really highlight, the importance of state legislatures, and the local level in bringing about change in so many important issues. So I think, this is really tough. It's really hard to put yourself out there sometimes, but being willing to go out there, take those risks, be willing to fail is ultimately how you'll be able to meet your goals and get to the next level, whatever that is for you.
Great advice. Take risks and take care of yourself. Let's give a round of applause for our incredible panelists. Thank you both so much. This was just awesome. Thank you. I'm going to just, they're amazing. Is our next speaker here? I'm looking. Oh, fabulous. Amazing. I'm going to introduce her. So I'm going to let Liz and Karen step off the stage here. We're going to move to our next. You can't go that way. You can't go that way. Go either way you want. Any way you want. And Tara, you can come on down. So a few weeks ago, last month, I had the privilege of going up to New York to an event called the Stop Trump Conference. Really, it was really fascinating. Featured speakers included Tara, me, also Michael Cohen was there, George Conway was there. It was a fascinating day. But the best part of the entire day for me was that I got to meet Tara. Because I've been hearing about Tara from everyone I know for like the last 2 years. So Tara McGowan is the founder and publisher of Courier Newsroom and CEO of Good Information, Inc., a civic incubator that invests in immediate solutions to counter disinformation online. Isn't that you asked a perfect question to tee up the disinformation question. She is a former political strategist who had an early career in journalism. She has seen firsthand how the information crisis has contributed to the rising threat of authoritarianism and the deterioration of social trust. In 2017, Tara founded Acronym, which is a nonprofit to build online infrastructure that deliberately reaches and informs the population of passive news consumers across the country who are most susceptible to be targeted by disinformation. Then she founded Courier Newsroom in 2019. Earlier in her career, she led a multi-million-dollar digital advertising and marketing programs for dozens of nonprofits and political groups, including Priorities USA, Next Gen Climate, and President Obama's 2012 re-election. She studied journalism and political science at NYU and began her career reporting and producing long-form journalism for 60 Minutes and PBS Frontline. Please join me in introducing and welcoming, giving a warm New Deal welcome to my friend, Tara McGowan.
Go here because let's see if this works. Yes. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here with all of you. I want to thank Debbie for inviting me and for the whole team. That is a very, very difficult group to follow because those three women I have been admiring and looking up to the better part of my career. So I am going to talk to you guys about disinformation and misinformation and what we can do about it. I would love to see a show of hands in this room of who has personally been a target of disinformation or misinformation. That's what I expected, me as well. You can look it up, just Google me. So this is going to be interesting because I have done this presentation a few times for a few different groups, but I knew walking into this room that I was walking into a room of folks who know this issue really intimately well. And I'm sure that I could also learn some things from all of you. But I'm going to start with a little bit of background. Now that you heard my whole life story, I don't have to give very much of an introduction to myself. But a lot of this will not be new information to you all, but what I do hope to do is share the expertise that I have gained over the past number of years, trying to really understand how to engage, inform, and mobilize people that are not very politically engaged, which we know is most Americans. But we also know that those are the folks that when they do tune in, when they do have good information or bad information that mobilizes them, they're the ones who make the difference in the elections that put all of you into elected office. And so that is how I sort of arrived at some level of expertise on this issue because we are facing a crisis of trust in this country. Trust in government and institutions and media are at unprecedented lows in this country. I don't actually have my, oh, it's over there. That's why. Hold on, guys. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of this, but you can read the slide. But 50 million Americans still believe that the 2020 elections were stolen. 20% of Americans believe QAnon is real. 64% of Americans believe that our democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. And on that bottom graph at the bottom, we now have more support for political violence in this country than we've had in my lifetime. So we all know here that we are at a real crisis moment here and abroad. And the reason for this crisis of trust has been a deliberate effort by a lot of really bad actors and networks that very intentionally sow mistrust and division in this country. And they do it by weaponizing information. And that's a tale as old as time, right? This is not new. Propaganda and disinformation and misinformation have always been utilized in order to sow mistrust and division and promote authoritarianism and ultimately dismantle democracies. Information wars are how the political wars are fought and won or lost. And you all know this. And this is a problem, though, that since it has existed, and the playbook hasn't changed very much. The media has, right? And our relationship to information and the media and how we consume it has changed dramatically, even just in my adult life. And so the playbook is still the same, but now it spreads a lot more quickly. And you guys can see some of the images here, but of just sort of some of the tenets of disinformation campaigns, right? You look for vulnerabilities and cracks in communities or societies that you can leverage. Maybe parents feeling insecure or overwhelmed or exhausted with little kids at home in a pandemic, and then suddenly a campaign for parents' rights, and something called CRT pops up to be able to weaponize that and give parents something to feel like they can gain their power and agency back with, even though it wasn't a real problem. Creating a big lie, seeding it, finding a helpful idiot, if you will, to be the messenger, denying everything, doubling down, undermining the media, calling it fake news, making sure people don't trust anyone but you, no matter if they did at any point in time. And as I'm sure we all know Bannon's famous quote, which is really going to also be the solution that I advocate most for in this room, is flood the zone, right? Be everywhere all at once with your lie, not for us a lie. Obviously, we don't need it. But you guys all know that old adage, if you hear a lie 3 times, it becomes the truth. You can hear it 35 times in an hour if you spend some time scrolling online. And to Liz's earlier point, it becomes very, very, very difficult to reverse once it's out there or to erase. I still get questions about things that were written about me that weren't true. And so it is something that we are all gonna have to live with and figure out how to live with and how to get ahead of. So that's what I wanna talk a little bit about with you all. So I'm going to talk about the media and the state of media quite a bit, because we are now in a very decentralized media ecosystem. I still remember I started my career, as Emily mentioned, at 60 Minutes in pretty the most traditional legacy media, actually, you guys could imagine. I started working there as an intern when I was 19, and I was full-time by 21, and I covered the 2008 election there, and I was one of the people pushing them to be on social media, which they were not amenable to at the time. But there was a time that I still remember when there were very few trusted channels and messengers where everybody got their news and information. And it wasn't perfect, but there wasn't as much choice, and so there was this sense of a common universal truth, right? We all lived with sort of one reality, for better or for worse. And then, of course, the internet changed that forever. And social media and big tech platforms accelerated that decentralization in a lot of ways. And of course, now we have the incredibly rapid evolution, like every day it's changing with artificial intelligence, that is going to make this problem that is already so severe and having severe life and death consequences already in this country and around the world much, much worse. There is going to be a very depressing section of this, but then we're going to get to the solutions, I promise. So Now that we are in this decentralized media environment, I want to talk about kind of what that looks like and what it means, and you guys all have firsthand experience with this, and I want to hear how you guys handle it as well, because when Google and Facebook, now Meta, came on the scene, they cannibalized the traditional advertising industry that kept news alive. So today, we have a disinformation economy. There are no viable business models. If you guys look at the headlines of media imploding, digital startups that were once successful with massive valuations, local news publishers shutting their doors, layoffs every day in the news and the media, there is not currently a viable business model for good information in this country. It is going to have to be subsidized by philanthropy and potentially government to be able to have it because of how far gone the infrastructure we had that enabled good information to exist and to be profitable has been decimated. So we don't have local news, and there's a lot of research that has proven out that there is a direct correlation between access to good local news and information and civic participation in this country. So that's another huge problem that we're facing. And in order to stay in business, the media outlets that have been able to, like New York Times, Washington Post, some name brands, if they haven't just been bought up by a billionaire willing to keep them alive, and they are actually profitable, it is because they have very narrowly prioritized their entire business models around paying consumers. At the local, state, and national level, people who will pay through paywalls. And I have written op-eds about how democracy dies behind a paywall. There is evidence now, thankfully, hopefully there will be more. The only people that pay through paywalls are college educated and above and of the wealthiest Americans. So we have an information gap that is now a massive chasm in this country because the tens of millions of Americans who are not willing to pay through paywalls, and they never will, they're not accessing any of that information even when it hits them on their newsfeed, if it does, which it likely won't with the algorithms. They're not watching cable news because they're not politically engaged. And by the way, cable news viewer numbers are abysmal. On a good night, it's about 3 million viewers. That's it for CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. But they are getting an enormous amount of information for free. Scrolling social media platforms, messaging apps, their email inboxes, talking to their friends and neighbors, and of course, the right-wing media, which I'm not going to talk too much about, but we all know how influential it is. They don't have to be consumers of right-wing media to be influenced by the narratives that are seeded, because the mainstream media then also picks up on those. Both sidesism is a massive problem I could do an entire conversation about, and happy to talk to anyone about anytime. And so this is really, really bad. I started to get really deep into this because I became obsessed with low propensity and non-voters in this country. I worked in Democratic politics for about a decade, and I really felt that it was strange that we were spending billions of dollars on a very tiny white, largely white slice of the electorate called swing voters in a few battleground states, and not spending nearly a quarter of the resources on what we were calling GOTV voters, right? People who don't vote every election, they need that extra nudge, but by the way, weren't actually building trust with them on a long-term basis. So that was how this journey started, is I became obsessed with this notion that if we actually built trusted relationships with the tens of millions of Americans, or the 44 million eligible voters who didn't vote, for instance, in the 2020 election, our margins wouldn't be so thin. The races wouldn't be so competitive in a lot of places because the vast majority of Americans actually support what the media calls progressive values, but what we all know are popular values and positions. And the media cares about dividing people because it keeps the story really rich, and the clicks and the engagement and the emotional triggers really, really, really raw. And so when I started studying this audience and trying to understand, there was a direct overlap of this audience and passive news consumption. people who don't watch cable news and don't pay through paywalls and who primarily get their news and information on social media. I was a digital strategist. That happened to be my bread and butter, is figuring out how to reach people in targeted ways on social platforms, and this was the audience that I wanted to cater to. And that's where I'm very grateful to the folks in the room who have newsrooms from our network in their state and have been stepping out to do interviews with some of our reporters upstairs. I'm going to talk a little bit about Courier, but we built Courier to serve this population specifically, knowing that you can no longer build media or news in this country and people come to you. You have to deliver it to them. You have to be very intentional about getting your information in front of audiences, and we're going to talk about that because that's one of the solutions. But a few more depressing points before we get to that. So if you guys haven't seen these headlines, Google, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok wasn't really a thing then, and now it's the biggest thing, and we will talk about TikTok. They were under pressure to have all of these policies after the 2016 election when it was proven that there was Russian disinformation and interference, especially on Facebook in the 2016 election. They built teams and advisory committees and commissions and reports, right? And they were under a lot of pressure, and they did institute a lot of policies. Most of them were porous and flawed. Some of them were bullshit entirely, excuse my language. But they still managed to roll all of them back over the past year without very much pushback, without very much pressure being placed on them. So the few safeguards we had in the 2020 election, which did make a difference, I believe, because Mark Zuckerberg himself turned off a button that they had in order to lift up after the election, when there was all of the disinformation about the big lie starting, he was able to actually increase the reach and volume of good factual news organizations, which he doesn't choose to do and hadn't chosen to do before that moment because it doesn't drive as much engagement, attention, or time spent on the platforms. He flipped that switch right back off after the insurrection. So we know that big tech can actually do something really significant about curbing this problem, but they're not doing it because they make too much money, and there is absolutely no political will in our Congress to do anything about it. So regulation is not going to save us anytime soon, which feels really, really scary. And it is in a lot of ways. And we do need the regulation, and we need to find the ways. And I have some slices of hope in me that the way is going to be through children because of the mental health crisis that we're seeing in our kids today, because of eating disorders and suicide rates going up, because of the algorithms and what our kids are living through now. But it's not going to happen on the timeline we need to save democracy in this country. So we're going to have to do more things, and we're all going to have to play a role in it. The other thing, and you guys all know this already, but traditional earned media and traditional communication tactics are not going to be enough. They're not even enough to be able to get your own messages across, never mind try to counter offensively disinformation or lies or propaganda. There is this constant conversation over why is the economy doing so well and no one seems to know about it or care. And there's a lot of different answers for that. But some of it is that that's not the information that they're getting at all. It's not emotionally connected, it's not resonant, it's not relevant. And the media is doing a real piss poor job of trying to actually inform the public, because they're really not even trying to. They are trying to keep people engaged and enraged. So what can we do about it? Offense, offense, offense. I'm gonna say it a million times. We have to go on offense. Before I get into the positive things and the things we can do, I do want to lift this up for folks that haven't had trainings or done work or read research on misinformation and disinformation. The number one rule when it comes to disinformation is to never give it more oxygen. That is against a lot of our impulses. We want to retweet the lie, quote tweet it, say the thing that's right. We want to debunk it in interpersonal conversations. We want to explain to people with the facts why what they're saying is not true or wrong. You've already lost at that point. You can't do it. And the worst thing is, especially online, is if you do try to debunk it, you are only spreading it farther. So I want everyone to take that away, if nothing else, is please do not quote, tweet, or reshare disinformation, even when your intentions are pure, in order to be able to correct the record. And that is different from what Liz said, which was very, very smart about nipping it in the bud as soon as you can. And there's a term for that we're going to talk about, which is called pre-bunking. Have folks in this room heard about pre-bunking before? Makes me so excited. You're going to learn something. That's so exciting. Another quick thing, though, not everybody can do this, of course, but one of the most effective ways to actually stop the bad actors and the disinformation is when they are held accountable. I think even though it was a settlement, it was a massive one, the Fox settlement from the defamation suit, and the Alex Jones settlement for the Sandy Hook victims. These are huge because these are expensive. This is accountability and punishment, and this will deter people and will deter media organizations over time, and so they are very effective. If you guys have heard of the organization Protect Democracy, it's incredible. My friend Ian Basson helped start it. They have an amazing report about this. They are actually actively doing a lot of defamation suits against Carrie Lake and others that they're supporting, because if we do hold folks accountable for lying, especially when there are real world consequences, that can make a difference. But of course, that's not in everyone's means. But I would consider seriously suing somebody if it's going to get the attention to correct the record, because it does help. But let's talk about the things that each of us can do. So the absolute best antidote to disinformation is good information, and good information is the lifeblood of democracy. And it doesn't mean facts versus salacious conspiracy theories. Like, facts are not going to win. They're not sexy. They don't engage our emotions at all. For all of the amazing nerds in this room, facts and statistics and numbers and evidence and science just aren't going to cut it. You have to wrap them in humor and engagement and conversation, and we can talk about all of that. So when I say good information, I don't mean just the dry facts. It does have to be factual, of course, and accurate, but there are ways that we can actually get it to gain traction. And it's necessary that we do when we don't have a lot of infrastructure doing it on our behalf anymore. So what does it mean to go on information offense? So these are just the few tactics that I'm going to go over quickly for each of these, but we're going to talk about pre-bunking. We're going to talk about trusted messengers. I hate to tell you all this, but I think you already know it. Regardless of what kind of Democrat you are, the fact that you have a capital D Democrat probably associated with your title means that's not the right messenger for everybody in your community about everything that you want to get across, and that's a good thing to recognize. In fact, sometimes it makes you the worst messenger, but you can still work with the right ones to be able to get your message across and achieve your goals. So again, everything that the incredible women said on stage before is true about knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, staying true to yourself and your brand and your expertise, but also knowing what you're not is really important, and being able to solve for that to also be able to drive good factual messaging to your communities is important. And then also there were some questions about this, and I know how overwhelming it is. I've been in this work for a long time on the digital side, but you do have a brand and you have to own it, and you have to directly communicate to your constituents and your audiences. Again, authentically, but it's so important, right? Jeff Jackson was lifted up because he is directly communicating and building a massive audience that he could never get by his comms team pitching him on all of the local news organizations that exist in North Carolina. Forget it. They would kill for his audience on TikTok. So you actually can be the media that you need, and it's really important that you find what's authentic for you in doing that. And then now you can finally leverage new and emerging media that are reaching audiences that traditional media is not, like Courier Newsroom, small plug, that we can talk about. But let's talk about pre-bunking. So pre-bunking has been found to be an effective strategy to inoculate audiences from disinformation before the saturation point. So that's the key, right? It has to happen before the disinformation gets to the point of no return. And usually when you hear about conspiracy theories or like QAnon or disinformation in the mainstream media that we all consume because we're high information consumers, it's too late. But when you really, really know, when you're sort of doing, your murder boards and your comm strategies and you're thinking about it. I'm sure you all already do this, but the most important thing is know your enemy, right? Know your opponents. Know exactly, put yourself in their shoes and know what they're going to try and take you down for or take your issue down for and get in their heads. One of the things that made me effective at my job was that I started consuming an enormous amount of right-wing media and disinformation. I created, because of a friend of mine who did this work professionally, I created a bunch of junk accounts on Instagram and TikTok and started following and liking and engaging with all of the sludge coming out of Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens, just to teach my algorithm that I was one of them so I could see how they were indoctrinating. And that made me much smarter about how they wield information and disinformation in order to think about what we have to do to inoculate and counter against it. And so I can't stress that point enough, is to really always think about all of the holes and the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities of your argument or your message or your campaign, so you can think about how to get ahead of those vulnerabilities and be able to educate your audience about them. And that doesn't just have to be about your own strategy, but it's really about any issue. And so these examples I put I remember the day that I think it was Jake Sullivan that came out of the Biden White House when they preempted Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And it was brilliant because that was pre-bunking. They knew that Russia was going to tell a very different story about what they were doing and why. And the White House made the decision to get out with confidential information they typically would not. And I'm sure there were a lot of debates about it, but they set the story, right? If you don't define yourself, you will be defined. And that was really important. And then there's small ways of doing it. There was a study that Google commissioned on pre-bunking. It was actually the first thing about pre-bunking I read a few years ago on vaccine disinformation. And what they did is they had trusted messengers. We're going to talk about all the tenets of pre-bunking, right? So we talked about anticipating and understanding the motivations of the bad actors or the opponents or the folks who might want you or your campaign to fail. Knowing your and their target audiences and the vulnerabilities with them. What are they feeling? Where are they unhappy or unrested? What are the things that they're going to want to tap into to be able to weaponize? And then using trusted messengers to do the pre-bunking, as I mentioned. People who are going to be trusted and expert on the issue at hand. So in this case with the Google study, they were health professionals, nurses, and doctors, but having them do the actual pre-bunking, which involves explaining the motivations. Karen said this really, really well, and I don't know if she knows that it's called pre-bunking, but it is being able to say, we know what they're doing. This is what's happening. There are people who want to dupe you. There are people who want you to believe something that is not true, and you actually show them examples of that. Because then when they see it, they feel smart, they feel empowered, they tell their friends and neighbors, oh, that's not true. And I know that. And that's a huge thing because people, when they've learned that they've believed disinformation, they retreat farther. They feel less secure about what they know. They feel less empowered, they feel less sure of themselves, and they retreat. And so when people feel informed, they do feel empowered and they feel agency. And so pre-bunking is intentional education for folks so they actually feel like they can be resilient, as opposed to feeling like they have been manipulated, and that doesn't ever make them feel or actually be more resilient to disinformation. So actually showing folks examples is really important. One of the other examples on the other slide at the very top is just about election disinformation, right? About fraudulent mail ballots, et cetera, saying there's a lot of folks that are gonna say this. There's no evidence to support it, have the trusted messengers talk about it, but this is what it's gonna look like, and make sure that, like, you ask questions about this, or you just know that this is out there and this is why. These are what their intentions are. So those are some of the points on this. There's a few different ways to do it, and you can't always do it, right? But it is something to think about when you think about being offensive, is getting ahead of things. So if you start to hear something in your community and it feels a little off, you maybe hear it a few times, but it hasn't been written about or it hasn't been reported on, that's a really good signal to be like, how do we get ahead of this? How do we think about who's doing this and why? Because it's probably going to be obvious to you, but it's not going to be obvious to your constituents or your audiences necessarily. And you always have to do that gut check and remember that, because often what is obvious to folks like us who do consume a lot of information readily and good information, we are living in a different reality than the folks that are getting all of their information online. So trusted messengers, talked about this, just some examples of that, but of course, people who are respected in communities and in different industries to be the ones that are coming out there. Real people from communities matter, right? Folks are much more persuaded now and influenced by people they feel like they have a relationship with or they actually have a relationship with. And that's why social influencers have replaced traditional advertising, because you're seeing them in their homes, you're seeing them with their kid or their dog, they're talking to you while they're out walking. Like, you feel like you have a real connection to them, whether they are a comedian, a makeup artist, a personal trainer, what have you. Those folks that cultivate those trusted relationships are really powerful. And because we don't live in a centralized or controlled media environment anymore, to the points that Liz and Karen were making so eloquently, you can't control your message anymore. You really can't, right? Being authentic is, as Liz said, you're gonna remember your truth better than you will something that put some lipstick on it. And so really making sure that you have messengers who are authentic and genuine and can be trusted and are trusted from the community is just so important. And meeting them where they are, which is the overwhelming part, but just knowing where they are. And the women before also touched on this, but these platforms are different. They have different audiences, and it's not just the distribution platforms, it's also different types of media. You really have to think about the audience you want to communicate to and understand where are they getting their information. Because that is going to tailor your communication strategy, your offensive strategy for reaching them. Because you might not need to meet folks on TikTok. I mean, I think you probably do if you have folks under 30 in your districts or your communities. It's a really important platform, and it is controversial, but it is necessary today. But also, a lot of communities use WhatsApp more than anything else to communicate with each other, and they're part of groups on that. And so, are there folks on your team or in your community or your volunteers or your friends who are on there who can help do some organizing and content seeding, as we call it at Courier, actually making sure that you're proactively placing links and stories of that you want folks to see in these places, because they're not going to come to them on their own. So always thinking about who your audience is and where they're getting their information so you can tailor the distribution of that using those trusted messengers to those platforms. And leverage new and emerging media. Courier is one example, but there are starting to be more. I'm a little bit biased, but having studied the industry, I think that we are now going back to an era where journalism started in this country, where it is ideological, it is personality driven, and it has a point of view. Part of the reason, and this is my belief, I cannot prove this, but it is my strong belief, part of the reason, outside of the intentional efforts to sow mistrust in mainstream and traditional media, part of the reason that so many people don't trust the media is because they know that objectivity was always bullshit. They want to know what you stand for. Because if you tell them that you don't stand for anything or you stand for everything, people of all ages and backgrounds don't buy it. There is always an agenda. There is always an editorial point of view or a business incentive, and all people are very smart to that. So yes, I would love a world in which we had unbiased, factual information media everywhere, but that's not where we are and that's not where we started. In fact, we started with progressive media in this country. It was the fuel behind the civil rights movement and every social movement in this country. And then we had sort of this golden era, depending on who you ask, of objective media and traditional media reaching everyone, and that era is gone. And we're not ever getting it back. It is self-selection now. It is about what Substack readers you like. It's about what podcasts you listen to, what personalities you're most engaged by. You've got to figure out who has the trust of the audience you want and leverage them. And at Courier, what we've done is we have built a news organization founded on these principles, where we have turned local print reporters into TikTok influencers. Our political reporter, Cam, in Arizona at Copper Courier, just won Best TikToker in Arizona, and he had never been on TikTok. He's an adjunct professor at the Cronkite School of Journalism. And our reporters are, as you can see, Michael McElroy, our North Carolina political reporter on your right. He is in his kitchen cleaning his brand new newborn baby bottles as he is breaking down the abortion ban that was just passed in the North Carolina State House. He did an amazing video a few weeks ago on gerrymandering, the horrific gerrymandering passed in North Carolina, using a metaphor for sports teams in North Carolina with a whiteboard. You've got to make this stuff digestible, interesting, and conversational for people. You don't have to be polished. In fact, the more polished videos we do, the less effective they are. It's about having direct conversations, and this media now provides that. Vertical video dominates. You don't all have to be Jeff Jackson, but you should all talk to your phones directly to your audiences in whatever way you're comfortable being yourself. And we built this whole news organization to do that, so we could actually package good information in ways that people will consume it. And then we measure the impact of it, and we have proven to increase support for Democrats and turnout among low turnout and non-voters simply by delivering local news to them where they are on social media and through email newsletters. And I suspect there are going to be a lot more news organizations and media outlets and content creators doing the work that we're doing on behalf of getting good information out, and that's how we are going to get ahead of this. Because back to the line I said before, that the best antidote to disinformation is good information, and that we have to flood the zone. We actually, disinformation, the impact is diluted and the spread slows if there is parity. It's not even about the winning message anymore. If there's as much of good information about an issue or topic as disinformation reaching people on the same channel, they are less likely to believe the disinformation, and it loses its potency. It is so potent when it is in a vacuum, because traditional media is not evolving their model to meet people where they are in authentic ways, because a lot of traditional journalists, reporters, and even politicians have not evolved their communication strategies to understand this. We have to be everywhere where our audiences are, and our messaging will win. We know that, but it's about how we communicate it and how we get ahead of it. And these are some, and I'll make sure you guys have this, but this is obviously for you. You probably all know this. You all have smarter teams and folks in your lives than me, I'm sure, but obviously to take care of yourselves. Two-factor, everybody. I'm sure you know that. We all know folks who've learned that the hard way. Do it everywhere and on everything. But plan for this, and also know that it's really lonely, as you guys know, who've been a subject of disinformation campaigns, because everybody who supports you is going to say that quietly, and everyone who doesn't is going to say it publicly. And it's really traumatic. And so it is really important that you have networks, that you take the best advice I've heard in ages from Karen Finney to prioritize self-care, because you're going to be confronted by it, but hopefully you feel a little bit more prepared for how to handle it and how not to amplify it and to shut it down, and to find the ways that we can actually hold these folks accountable until we do have the means for regulation and a change in the industry. And right at the bell. I didn't even plan it. So happy to take questions if we have time.
Thank you so much. Very valuable information. I'm Cassie Franklin, Mayor of Everett, Washington, and I'm curious how you battle misinformation when it's just slightly untrue or a negative spin. That's what we are fighting all the time. And so it's not like these big, bold, blatant lies, local government. It's more just slightly untrue.
Yep, it's a great question. And for folks who don't know, although I'm sure everyone in this room does, the distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is very intentional, it's seeded. Misinformation is people repeating things they heard, they don't know it's not true. It's not nefarious, right? But one leads to the other. And of course, misinformation is harder because it's like telephone. It's not preventable, really. So, I mean, I think a lot of the same things ring true. You want to say the true thing as many times as possible, as consistently as possible, in as many places as possible, and don't back down, right? Because the intentional disinformation does not back down. That's what's so powerful. It's the repetition. Repeat the truth. Repeat the right thing. It's tough because you're always going to have like attacks and things of that nature. You have to be really selective of understanding what are the things that are going to pop and are going to harm you later versus what are the things you don't touch, because it's only going to give it more fuel. And more often than not, they're things not to touch if you haven't, if it's just slightly off, or if it's often reaching and within a community that you're not going to change otherwise, right? We talk about some folks, the Kool-Aid drinkers, they're beyond the point of having rational conversations because they do live in alternate realities. And that is far above my pay grade, how we de-radicalize folks like that. But for the ones that it just becomes kind of water cooler conversation spread, you want to just say the true thing as often as possible, find excuses to say it, find ways to hook it to other things, just so there's so much more of that out there.
Hi, thanks. Nicole Clowney, I'm from Arkansas, and I really appreciated the question from the Utah legislator at the end of the last panel. I don't know if she's still here, but one of the things that we face as Democrats in very, very red states is making points to our constituents without vilifying our colleagues. And so you had at the bottom of one of your slides, empower people, like sort of when we are talking about the motivations behind the disinformation, how do you have any tips for how folks like us can communicate that information in a way that doesn't vilify our colleagues and also doesn't make our colleagues feel like we're accusing them of having been manipulated? In other words, how do we give them cover maybe, or make them still feel like we're on their team while communicating with our own constituents?
It's such a good question, and it's so funny. The way that I'm going to start the answer is interesting because I don't actually advocate for this ever, except in this situation, which is Michelle Obama's "when they go low, you go high." I actually don't think that's true often in politics, to be very honest, with nuance. But in this scenario, I actually think that there is a real opportunity to always start with a common ground with a person that you disagree with, right? Like, I know your kids, or you have kids the same age as me, or I know that we both had this, right? What is the touch point that suddenly brings the temperature down to then be able to say the thing, because then it becomes a lot more difficult. And if they do punch back or they do come at you for that, they're going to look so much worse than them starting it, right? And so the more you can also do that proactively to be able to ingratiate sort of yourself and just bring the temperature down. It might not always work because they don't care, but it is going to serve you better, and it's going to make people tune in more, I believe, to what you are saying, because most folks actually don't want that level of engagement, but they do become accustomed to it and emotionally triggered by it. And so I think it's always about bringing the temperature down if you can.
Hi, Sharon McBride. I'm the president of the City Council in South Bend, Indiana, also a former national co-chair for Mayor Pete. And one of the things that you talked about, and also Liz, and the misperception and disinformation that people put out. It was less than 1% of our total population that was spreading the lies and the disinformation. And it took a lot of work for us to, stand up and debunk a lot of the information, and still go through that now. And in our community, people know that the agitators were the naysayers and were feeding misinformation. But as a whole, throughout the world, a lot of people believed that. And it was hard, and it took people time to get to know him themselves to see that he was authentic and true. So I think some of the things that we still go through is every time he speaks, you have CNN or Fox News or the media outlets reach out to us to still try to have to defend his record. So after this time goes by, do you have any like suggestions for still the world platform of still trying to misrepresent who he is?
It's so hard. I wish I had better advice on this. I think time is what it takes, and I think the more that in this situation, there is so much more content and opportunity, right, and presence that it will become less over time. But the reason that that's happening is because they need that both sides argument to every story, even if it's no longer relevant or current. And that is what Karen was saying about, or Liz was saying about how they dip back and they're going to dip back. And so it is really challenging. It really is about how can there be so much more good information to the audiences, factual, current information all the time, because then it becomes just less believable and less resonant. But it is tough because the media is going to keep doing it, especially if they don't have, this is something I think a lot about with, knock on wood, but the Hunter Biden stuff not getting very much traction. There's a lot of reasons for it, but when the media did back down on it, it's my belief that that's why they talk about Biden's age so much, because they don't have another counterpoint. And they need to talk about a negative because there's so many negatives they need to report on Trump. And so they're always going to need to have a contrast negative. And so the Republicans know that, right? And then they try to decide what that is that's going to benefit them the most. And then when that falls flat, the media is left with nothing. That's what I've often said to people in closed doors, because that conversation happens all the time, I'm sure to all of you as well. But you're hearing about it all the time because they have nothing worse to tell you. And it's a fact. That is his age. So I think that's the other thing that you can do to sort of take some wind out of those sails is be like, that's what they're talking about. We all know it's not true, and they're talking about it because they don't have anything negative to say.
Krista Griffith from Delaware. Thanks so much. I've learned a lot and really appreciate your comments. Any advice on what to do to encourage colleagues to not be so skittish when they've been victims of a disinformation campaign? I had a bill that was a relatively mundane insurance bill. What it did was protected sensitive health information from falling into the hands of a subscriber on the whoever held the insurance policy through explanation of benefits plan. Again, it was really mundane. But what it did was protect really private information from the patient, so it didn't get into the hands of parents or others who had the policy. Tucker Carlson got a hold of it and basically, lit up everybody in opposition in my state to the legislation, and now nobody will go anywhere near it. So any advice when you've been victimized and you've had a really good idea that would have helped a lot of people, bring back life to that when it's just been pulverized by folks like Tucker Carlson. I will say, he did say that I hated my father, and my dad did call me right away and said, I've never been more proud of you. So anyway, there was a light with that.
Whenever right-wing media writes about me, it's a badge of honor, for sure. But it also causes a lot of problems. It is so interesting. I don't know if you've tried this. The thing that comes to mind is repackage, rebrand. Do all of the things, right, about finding ways to kind of build bridges and alliances with it, calling it truly a different name. And trying that after some time has passed on it to get some support around it, because the thing is, nobody ever wants to go first. I've started a lot of really disruptive things, and that is the thing that I have learned, is that the first one and the one who takes the risk takes the arrows, and then a lot of people jump on board once the time passes and they realize that it's actually effective, or it's something they can make money off of, or whatever it is. And so I think you do give it a little bit of time, but you present it in an entirely different way, and you try again. Sure.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I would love, by the way, big fan of your Packernym work specifically. I'm Chris Medina from Leadership Now Project, membership organization of business leaders. I would love your take on Turning Point USA and what they've done well and what could be learned or replicated from their success.
Woof. Yeah. So Turning Point USA, for folks who don't know, I I have this thing, they have this tick where I like to, I don't like to, but I end up forgetting the names of these horrific people. Charlie Kirk started it. So Turning Point USA started, I believe, as a college campus and college student-focused organization. It has a lot of similarities to Prager University and their ideological and content strategy, if folks are aware of them. A massive, in my opinion, fraudulent C3 organization that spreads a lot of nonpartisan disinformation that sows division, especially around gender issues and misogyny and feminism. Charlie Kirk is of that brand. He has built a very large network of young people in particular that are now aging, more my age, but they're still reaching a lot of young people around the country with a lot of physical conferences and convenings and networking like this one. To build a bunch of new leaders, essentially, in the far right. These are folks that are the ones who are the followers of Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens and things of that nature. And so it's pretty insidious and it's very smart organizing. And they've been doing it for a while. I feel like similar to how Ben Shapiro and Daily Caller have started to invest in feature-length films and children's programming, they feel like they have to compete because liberals, if you will, have sort of owned those industries, and so they want to create right-wing content. I think that in that vein, liberals have kind of owned young people and college campuses. So I feel like that is their proactive offensive effort to actually be able to try to turn a corner with young people because they know it's a real problem. I don't think it's working as well as they would like, which is why I don't worry about them too much. But you know, their tribal and evangelized mentality is so dangerous and powerful because they are the minority, but they are loud and they are savvy and they are getting in rooms all the time, having very clear-eyed conversations about what needs to be done for them to win at all costs, at any costs. And I do feel that on our side, which is pretty much any side except that, we tend to still believe that how could people do things that they do? And then every day we wake up and they do, and we have to be a lot more clear-eyed that, yeah, they are going to block a Supreme Court justice under Obama and then push theirs through. Yes, they are going to buy the Supreme Court. Yes, they are going to suppress votes. They are going to do, so I think that they're in those rooms figuring out those strategies, and then we often are caught back-footed, unbelieving that folks could do those things and be that insidious. And so I often say that we really just have to be very clear-eyed about those things because we do have the majority on our side. We do have the popular values and issues on our side, but we have to be far more sophisticated and aggressive and offensive about owning those and staying true to them and reinforcing them and not believing that just because most people support those things, they're hearing about them or they're being mobilized around them. That was all we had time for, but thank you guys so much. You're a great audience, and I'm going to stick around.
All right. Thank you guys so much for a great first day. A couple of quick notes before we break. For tomorrow morning, breakfast is going to open at 8 o'clock. The program will begin at 8:45. And for tonight, those of you joining us at the VIP dinner, there will be bus transport available from the hotel leaving at 6 o'clock. So please be in the lobby by 5:45 or thereabouts so that the buses can leave on time. And the most important note, dinner is informal because we will be bowling. So take an hour, get changed, rest up a little bit, and we'll be in the lobby at 5:45 to leave. Thank you all.